It was one of those cold, gray mornings where everything felt like it was moving just a little too fast. People rushed by, heads down, faces buried in their scarves, the icy wind cutting through the streets. But for Anna, it felt like the world was slowing down, as if she had been frozen in time. The weight of her recent struggles felt heavy in her chest, and the dreams she once had seemed distant. Then, out of nowhere, she noticed him, a lonely figure huddled on a park bench, looking like the world had passed him by too. Anna was in her early 30s, trying to carve out a life in the city, but the weight of bills, failed job interviews, and endless hours spent chasing small freelance gigs was taking its toll. Today, she was especially tired. She'd spent all week juggling her 2 part-time jobs, and it felt like nothing was ever enough. As she walked home from another exhausting shift, all she could think about was how she could barely afford the comfort of a warm meal. But the sight of the elderly man sitting on the bench caught her attention. Something in his posture, a mixture of sadness and solitude, made her pause. Walking through the city had become a routine for Anna, one she didn't particularly mind. The busy streets were full of people going about their lives. But today, everything seemed to blur around her. She couldn't seem to shake the feeling of defeat that had settled into her chest. It was hard to stay hopeful when every job opportunity felt just out of reach. She had bills to pay, debts that seemed to grow each month, and still, no one seemed to care. The city felt so cold, both physically and emotionally. People rushed by her with their own burdens and worries, leaving Anna feeling small and insignificant. She had no real friends in the city, only acquaintances. There was no one she could turn to for advice or support. The few times she had tried to reach out, she had been met with silence or vague promises of help that never came. Her parents lived across the country, and while they did their best to support her emotionally, Anna knew they had their own struggles to deal with. It made her feel even more isolated, as if her life was a puzzle she couldn't quite piece together. That morning, she had hoped for a better day, a small break from the chaos of her life. Instead, she was left alone again, walking home from a shift, feeling the weight of every failure she'd experienced. But then, as she passed the park, she saw him. The man was hunched over, his body wrapped in a thin, worn-out coat. He looked older than she expected, maybe in his late 70s, his face deeply lined with age and sorrow. His eyes were fixed on the ground, and from a distance, Anna could see the faintest glint of tears. His hands were visibly trembling, and he seemed to be carrying more than just physical cold. There was a heaviness that made him appear invisible to the rest of the world. As Anna stood there, watching, something tugged at her heart. She couldn't just walk by. She couldn't help but wonder about him, about the life he must have led. What had brought him here, to this moment of sadness, to this lonely bench in the middle of a bustling city? The thought that he had no one to sit beside him on Christmas Eve made her feel even more isolated. She wondered how many others had passed by him today, without a second glance. People were always in such a rush, moving with their own agendas, their own goals, and their own problems. But Anna saw something different in the old man. His frailty spoke of more than just age. It spoke of a life lived with burdens too heavy to bear. As she moved a little closer, Anna saw that his eyes were closed now, his face twisted in pain, perhaps from the cold or from the weight of his thoughts. He seemed to be lost in his own world, trying to escape the reality of his situation. She noticed that he didn't ask for help, nor did he try to reach out to anyone passing by. He had resigned himself to his loneliness, his need for connection locked behind a mask of stoicism. Anna felt a pang in her chest. She had known this feeling, the quiet sadness that came with being alone. In the city, it was so easy to disappear, to blend in with the crowd, to feel invisible. The only difference was, Anna had never truly given up. She had held on to the hope that things would get better, that one day, something or someone would change the course of her life. But this man, he seemed to have stopped believing in that hope long ago. She felt a sudden surge of empathy. The pain in his eyes reflected the loneliness that had been building inside her for months. It was as though she saw herself in him, two souls adrift, separated by circumstance, but connected by a shared unspoken sorrow. She stood there for a few more moments, unsure of what to do. Should she simply walk by like everyone else, or should she try to do something, anything, to make his day just a little better? Her instinct kicked in, and before she knew it, She was already turning around, walking into the nearest coffee shop. Her wallet was nearly empty, but it didn't matter. She had to do something for him. Something small but meaningful. Anna's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her purse, counting the last few bills. The coffee shop was warm, and the comforting smell of fresh coffee mixed with the sugary sweetness of pastries filled the air. She ordered a hot coffee and added a small pastry to her order, her mind telling her to stick with something simple. Asterisk. Just a little something asterisk, she thought, as she fumbled for her card to pay. The man hadn't asked for anything, but she couldn't stand the thought of him being cold and hungry, not when she could offer even a small comfort. When she returned, her heart raced. She wasn't sure if he'd accept her offer, but she felt a strong pull toward him. Holding the cup in her hands, she walked toward him, her steps slower now, mindful of the fragile man she was approaching. She cleared her throat gently, unsure if he'd even hear her. "Excuse me, sir," Anna said softly, hoping not to startle him. The elderly man looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. He didn't speak at first, just stared at the warm cup she was offering. Anna smiled nervously, her fingers gripping the cup tightly, trying to keep her hands from trembling. "It's really cold out here. I thought you might like something warm." The man's gaze softened, his face lifting just enough for her to see a flicker of gratitude. Slowly, with shaking hands, he took the coffee from her. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. For a moment, the world around them seemed to fade, leaving just the two of them in a quiet moment of connection. Anna's steps slowed as she approached the bench, the warm coffee in her hands, suddenly feeling much heavier than she anticipated. She hadn't planned on stopping for long, just enough to offer a brief moment of warmth for the elderly man, but now that she was standing there, she realized the significance of what she was doing. Her mind raced. She didn't know this man, had no idea why he was sitting there, and wasn't sure if he would even accept the gesture. But something inside her told her this wasn't just about the coffee. It was about offering a sliver of humanity to someone who seemed so lost. As she stood still, trying to muster the courage to speak, she observed him more closely. The man's head was down, his body hunched forward, as though trying to protect himself from the harshness of the world. His coat was thin, and it didn't seem to provide much protection against the cold. It was obvious that he was a stranger to the hustle of city life. There was something about the way he sat so still, so silent, that made him seem like an outcast in a sea of busy, rushing people. For a moment, Anna wondered if she was making a mistake. Was he the type of person who would appreciate her offer, or would he simply see it as pity? But then she reminded herself of the reason she had stopped. He looked like he needed something, anything, and she could give him something small, something simple. It wasn't much, but it was better than walking away, pretending he didn't exist. Her heart beat faster as she approached, her breath visible in the cold air. She had to act quickly, before she lost her nerve. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The man looked up, startled, his tired eyes locking with hers. His expression softened, and for a brief second, Anna caught a glimpse of something other than sorrow, something like surprise, or perhaps even hope. I thought you might want something warm," Anna continued, holding the coffee toward him. "It's really cold out here." He blinked for a moment, still seeming caught off guard by the offer. His hand shook slightly as he took the coffee, and Anna couldn't help but notice how fragile he seemed. He wasn't young, but there was something about the way he moved, his slow, deliberate gestures, that made him appear even older than he probably was. The weariness in his eyes seemed to deepen as his hands clasped around the cup, and Anna thought she saw the faintest tremor in his fingers. "Thank you," the man murmured, his voice hoarse, as if it hadn't been used much. There was something about the way he said those words, as though they carried more weight than just gratitude. It struck Anna deeply. He wasn't just thanking her for the coffee, it was as if he was thanking her for seeing him, for acknowledging his existence, if only for a moment. Anna didn't know what else to say, so she simply sat down beside him on the bench, offering him her presence in the quiet cold air. For a few minutes there was no conversation, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the muffled noises of the city in the distance. She could feel the weight of his sadness, as if it hung in the space between them, and she understood why he hadn't spoken much. There were some burdens too heavy to voice. Anna glanced over at him, unsure if she should break the silence, or just stay with him in the moment. She didn't know why she felt compelled to sit there, to offer him company, but somehow, it felt right. After what felt like an eternity, the man finally spoke, his voice cracked but steady. "You don't know what this means to me," he said softly, looking down at the coffee cup in his hands. "You're the first person in a long time who's treated me like I matter." His words hit Anna like a wave. She didn't know what to say, so she just smiled softly, her heart swelling with a mix of sadness and warmth. She couldn't explain why this man's words affected her so much. They weren't just words. They were a glimpse into a life that had been ignored for far too long. She stood up, feeling the familiar weight of the cold on her skin once more, but this time, it didn't feel as heavy. "I'm glad I could help," she said, a simple line, but one that felt important. "I hope you stay warm." As she turned to walk away, the man's voice stopped her. "I hope one day, you understand how much your kindness has meant," he added, his voice barely above a whisper. Anna smiled and nodded, her heart full. She left the park, unaware of how this small encounter would soon transform her life. An hour later, as Anna sat at home, her dinner plans forgotten, the sound of a knock on her door startled her. She wasn't expecting anyone, especially not this late. Frowning, she glanced at the clock. It was almost dark. She walked cautiously to the door, wondering who it could be. When she opened the door, she was taken aback to see 4 well-dressed men standing on her doorstep. Their suits were impeccable, their expressions stern but polite. Behind them, standing tall with a presence that commanded attention, was none other than the elderly man from the park. Anna blinked in surprise. The man she had seen on the bench, so fragile and alone, now stood before her, but there was no sign of the cold or sorrow that had once marked his face. Instead, he looked dignified, his posture straight, wearing a tailored suit that made him look far younger than he had on the bench. His presence was commanding, almost otherworldly compared to the frailty he had shown earlier. "Good evening, Miss Anna," the man said, his voice now deep and clear. His gaze was firm yet warm. "I'm Robert Collins. You might remember me from the park. I'd like to speak with you about a matter of great importance." Anna's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. This couldn't be the same man, could it? She barely had time to speak before Robert motioned for the lawyers to hand her something, a large envelope. "I wanted to thank you for the kindness you showed me. It's rare to see such warmth in the world, and I've been following your progress for some time," he explained. Anna opened the envelope slowly, her fingers trembling as she saw the contents. Inside was a job offer, an offer for a high-paying position at a prestigious marketing firm that Robert owned. Not only that, but a significant sum of money was also enclosed. Anna gasped, unable to believe what she was seeing. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I didn't help you for anything in return." Robert smiled knowingly. "You helped me in a way that no one else has. I want you to know that kindness is never forgotten. I see in you the drive and heart we need at my company." As she walked into her new office days later, Anna couldn't believe how everything had changed. The cup of coffee she had given a stranger had unlocked doors she never knew existed. The world had opened up in ways she hadn't thought possible, and all because she had chosen to stop and offer a simple gesture of kindness. Anna stood frozen for a moment, staring at the envelope in her hands as if it might slip through her fingers and vanish into thin air. Her mind raced with disbelief. She opened the thick cream-colored paper slowly, the contents carefully revealed. Inside was not just a letter. There was an official offer letter for a high-paying position, at a prestigious marketing firm no less. She blinked, her thoughts scattered, her heartbeat quickening. For a moment she couldn't quite grasp the reality of it. The letter was signed by Robert Collins, the man she had helped earlier that day in the park. She recognized his name from the business world, a name that carried weight and respect, yet here it was in her hands, an offer she never imagined receiving. She looked up at Robert, her breath still caught in her throat, and for a moment she couldn't find the words. He stood there, calm and composed, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. "Are you serious?" she stammered, unable to hide the confusion in her voice. Robert smiled, his eyes warm with understanding. "Yes, Miss Anna, I am. I've been following your work for some time. You've got the skills and the heart. I saw that in you the moment you offered me that cup of coffee." Anna's mind spun with the impossibility of it all. She had never imagined that the simple act of kindness, something she had done without a second thought, would have such a far-reaching impact. She had thought it was just a gesture, something small to help a man who seemed to need it. But this was a life-changing opportunity that seemed to drop from the heavens, and it was all because she had seen someone in need and done what she felt was right. The envelope also contained something else, a check, a sum of money that was enough to pay off her debts and give her the kind of financial freedom she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just a job offer, it was a chance to turn her life around, to step into a future she had only dreamed of. She had worried for so long about paying bills and scraping by, but now, here was the opportunity to breathe, to live without constantly looking over her shoulder. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you choose me?" Robert's expression softened, and his gaze held something deeper, something that reached into the very core of Anna's being. "Because you didn't see me as just a homeless man, Miss Anna. You saw a person. You gave me kindness when no one else did. That's rare, and that's exactly the type of person I want at my company. People with heart, who understand that success isn't just about the bottom line, it's about connection. You demonstrated that with a single gesture, and I respect that." Tears welled up in Anna's eyes, and for a moment, she felt completely overwhelmed. Her chest tightened with emotion, both joy and disbelief, and her voice broke as she spoke again. "I didn't do it for anything in return. I didn't expect this." Robert nodded. "That's what makes it all the more meaningful. Kindness, when it's not done for personal gain, is the most powerful thing. It's a rare gift in a world that often rushes by without pausing for a moment to connect." The weight of his words settled over her like a comforting blanket. Anna's eyes scanned the letter again, the offer for the position feeling like a dream. She had been struggling for so long, hoping for a break, but she never expected it to come in such an unexpected way. She had done something small, something that felt right, and now her life was about to change forever. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, still in shock. "I can't believe this is happening." Robert's smile was kind, full of understanding. "You don't need to say anything. I know it's a lot to take in, but think of it as a chance, an opportunity not just for work, but to change your life in ways you can't even imagine right now." As Anna looked down at the offer letter, and the check in her hands, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the path that had led her to this moment. A simple cup of coffee, a small act of kindness, those had been the catalysts for this incredible transformation. And as she stepped into this new chapter of her life, she knew one thing for sure: kindness had brought her here, and it was kindness that would carry her forward. As she glanced up at Robert, the man who had once sat alone on the park bench, she realized that sometimes the most significant changes come not from striving or chasing after success, but from the quiet moments of empathy that change everything. And for Anna, this was just the beginning. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice full of emotion. "Thank you for believing in me." Robert's expression softened even more, and he nodded. "The pleasure is mine, Miss Anna. Welcome to your future." And just like that, Anna's life was no longer defined by the weight of her struggles. It was now filled with possibility, with a future that gleamed brighter than she had ever dared to imagine.